Hello and welcome to the next episode of Bonsai Stuff Podcast. It's me, Scott Martin, again from Bonsai Matsu, Melbourne, Australia. It's the start of March 2020. We've just ticked over into the autumn season, and looking outside, there's rain been coming down for a couple of days. Temperatures have drastically dropped. Everything's very lush, very green. The initial burst of growth that happens generally around the start of autumn has happened. You know, the Cedars have pushed out a few new leaves. Nothing like the spring new growth that comes, which is rampant and continual. The autumn one seems to be, well, it is definitely just a few pairs of leaves or a small burst of growth, and then it seems to stop as the tree starts preparing for the winter dormancy that's coming up. The leaf colour has started to change definitely on a few of the deciduous, some not so quickly, but others it definitely has. So it gives us a pleasant reminder that we're getting into quite a busy time of the year coming up with autumn pruning, especially feeding and stuff like that as well. And then for those of us with pines, the winter, late autumn, early winter season is go time for pines. So all that work we've done with decandling and making them pretty and putting them in nice sun, and now they're starting to look pretty shaggy. There's lots of new growth on there. It's pretty rampant. The buds have extended. Needles are starting to push out now. There's nice, vibrant, coloured growth on there, but we need to in the next couple of months start getting in there and sorting that out and putting them back into shape. But anyway, for now, I just want to go through what the plan is for the podcast for you guys. So first up, I want to talk initially about pad profiling and how I approach the pruning of an individual pad. It's easy to get lost when you're looking at a tree, knowing where to start and where to finish. But if you break it down to a smaller, more manageable level, and we could talk about an individual pad and how I approach the pruning of that pad, then you just multiply that same thing over and over and over. So we're going to go through pad profiling today. The next thing I want to talk about is pruning when I'm going through and on any tree. You know, and there might be a cluster of growth. It's a really common thing that I get I hear all the time where people say, well, where do I start? Like, how do you know which one to keep? How do you know what's the best? So I want to go through what my process is, which is the process of elimination. We start with removing the most wrong, and then we work our way through till we end up with what's the best of the bunch that were there in the first place. So we'll talk about that. I want to talk about also what's happening, what my plans are for my garden and my trees over the next sort of month, to give you guys something to focus on as well, and hopefully, you know, a little bit of what I'm talking about, what I'm offering, I suppose, helps you guys as well to improve or strengthen your trees in your collection as well. And then we'll get on to the what's on the bench section of the podcast, which appears to be pretty popular, which is great. Really nice to get some feedback about it. And I've been steered down the path that this one needs to be on an Atlantic cedar. It was something I put up on Instagram not too long back, Blue Atlantic Cedar, which is a really, really nice tree. Beautiful. One of my favourites. Developed really nicely. Got great age on it. So I want to go through some specifics, I suppose, with cedars and some general information about cedars that might be of interest. And then I reckon we'll be almost out of time for this podcast. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy it. I do appreciate the feedback, and let's get into it, eh? So before we get into pad profiling, I just want to say that I love bonsai because it's a great consistency in the world. You know, trees seem to be forever going on, you know, with their own challenges, of course, which we can definitely manage and improve on. But you know, the world's an interesting place at the moment. There's a lot happening about it, which I don't really want to get into. But you know, in Australia we have this panic buying of items because of a global virus, which may or may not affect us, and it's not these things going on in the world. I love that we can look back and we can lean on our bonsai and just go, you know what, no matter what's happening, you can put on a pair of blinkers and focus purely on what's in front of you on the table, and for everything that you put into your bonsai, it comes back tenfold. So anyway, I just wanted to say that anyone involved in bonsai, you guys are great. And we're a great community, and let's focus on some positive stuff. So let's talk about pad profiling. All right. So when you're doing maintenance pruning on a deciduous or developing a pad or something like that, you've always got to think about the profile that you want. You don't want to try to flatten the pad out too much. So when I first get a pad and I'm developing it, and I wire that pad out, I'll wire the primary branches, then I'll wire the secondary branches, and I'll put them into like a very flattened sort of structure. Then as the foliage then starts to grow, let's talk about removal of up and down growing foliage. I agree you should remove the underside of the profile, underside of the pad. That should be very clean. That should be nice and crisp. So when you look at the pad, you know exactly where the bottom of it is, and you see the structure of that pad from underneath the tree. But the ones growing up, if they're growing directly up, like I'm talking, full vertical, then yes, they're removed. But if they're on an angle, like say 45-degree angle or something like that, on top of a pad, they're the ones that I definitely keep, because when you think about your pad and some of the great trees that you've seen photos of, or you've seen at shows, or wherever you've seen them on the internet, they're great because they've got depth. The pads aren't flattened to a sort of a one-dimensional sort of plane. They're very much a 3D type object, and that's because some of that upward growth on the angle has been kept and maintained to grow out in a natural direction. So I find my personal approach is that if I heavily wire a tree when I first work on it, and I set those primary branches, then when they're set in place, then I go and wire the secondary branches, and when they're set in place, then I move along to the clip and grow method, which is basically making a cut or pruning a branch back to a point where you expect a bud to grow in a direction, and move that branch in a certain shape or a certain area. So we can clip and grow branches so that they don't cross over each other and they grow out naturally in a forking outwards manner, and we end up with a really natural looking tree that, yeah, sure, it's been wide, it's been shaped, it's been, it's had human fingerprints put on it, but the branches then start to take on this natural sort of look as well, because they're growing naturally they would based on where those buds are being left to force the growth. So when you are pruning the branch, or you get to a branch on a tree, when I think about pad profiling, I think about isolating that individual branch. So it's like putting a piece of paper around all the other part of the tree, so all you're looking at is that one pad when you start pruning. And then when you prune, clean the underneath side of the pad. Don't look big picture, just look little picture, and try and get your shape of the pad that you desire, which for me, a lot of those ones are sort of like a nice smooth sort of rounded shape coming out from the trunk, and then into like a cloud pattern almost, sort of, for the branch itself, where it structures up. So when you're pruning, you want to make it that you've got individual branches. So rather than looking at the side of a tree and looking at one big branch that spreads right the way across that tree, try and isolate it down. So you're working with maybe 4 or 5 different branches within that one current big pad. It sounds confusing. It's really hard to talk about with the podcast, but what you want to do is, rather than having one big area to look at, you want 4 or 5 or 2 or 3 or whatever it is, however many you can break that branch into different pads. And when I say different pads, I mean have them not on the same horizontal level and not the same vertical level, but split them around so they're on different planes. So when you look at the tree from the front, it looks like there's a lot of pads or a lot of interest happening around that area of the tree. It draws your eye in a lot further. Rather than seeing one big massive clump of growth, seeing those broken areas creates interest, and it draws you into the tree and makes you have a look through it. So positioning the pads can be done with wiring as well. So when you're pruning, we talk about the clip and grow to continue the pad and continue the shape of the pad. But if you've got two branches sort of side by side on a horizontal plane with each other, and you go, well, instead of being now one pad, I'm going to split you two apart. And as you look at it, there's one on the left and one on the right. Take one of them and drop it down slightly and slide it across further to the direction it's growing. So if it's on the right-hand side, just drop that one down a little bit to the outside of the tree and slide it across to the right a little bit. And the one on the left, maybe just raise it up a little bit too and move it a little bit to the left. So that way you've got lots of air, lots of sunlight getting into those pads now. So the part that was joined, that was one part that made them from two pads into one pad, suddenly gets a lot of the sun's energy, and therefore it can grow the buds that we need and give it more depth to the pad. So the wiring of those two should be really nice, clean, light wire. Doesn't need to be big and strong and heavy. It should just be enough to simply focus on the two core branches, move those two into position, and then don't worry about the other. Don't worry about wiring all the fine detail on the rest of the branches. You'll find that if you do a lot of fine detail wiring on really, really super thin branches, you're under risk of breaking those branches before they've had time to mature and develop bark and be able to compensate for any rough treatment that wiring causes them with breaking and movement and that sort of stuff. So I find it's far safer just to wire the key core of those pads that you're going to be shuffling around, and it also means that you don't have to worry about redesigning when 3 weeks later you go out there to look at the tree and part of the new pad that you've developed's gone brown because it's been broken in the wiring process. When you are working on creating your different pads, like your separation of pads, and you're working on the profile from them, I find it's really, really important to stand back from your work and look at it. If you are maybe 30 centimeters away from the tree when you're pruning, and you're thinking everything looks great and it's separated and there's nice distance and they're on different planes, horizontal, vertical, all that stuff, stepping back from the tree, like I'm talking going back maybe 3, 4, 5 meters, something like that, getting on the same eye level as those pads, you'll see it from a different perspective, and you'll actually see little things that maybe you didn't pick up when you're sort of magnified or close to the tree when you're doing the work. I do find also having it against a solid colour background, like I use a black backdrop for photos and that sort of stuff. When I'm working fine, delicate stuff, I'll also drop that down. So when I stand back, I can see things that maybe I couldn't see up close. I always have in my head an up and out image. So if you get your fingers and you push them up and you push them out, and that's how I imagine branches on a pad or an apex, something like that, reaching out as well. Not where the branches are crossing over each other. So if you turn your hands inwards and they cross over each other, that's what I don't want to see when I'm standing back looking at my tree. I want to try and have it so each branch has got its own space, its own up and out, and then the fine twigs are coming up and out, and everything's like, sure, there's going to be little things crossing over each other, but really you want everything to be following the same sort of direction, not exactly, but the same sort of direction, so you get that feeling of up and out. And I find, for me, it really works well when I stand back and I review the work and look at it slowly and get my eye height to exactly the same height as the branch or the apex or whatever it is that I'm working on or the pad that I'm working on at that time, so you can review it. Makes you look at things maybe not quite so two-dimensional too, like having it on a turntable, being able to turn it around and look at the pads from a side or the apex from a side with your pruning process that you're going through will be beneficial as well, because you're not just looking at it from like a camera would look at it, like a photo, you would look at it like that. Having it so you can turn it around and try and get that, when you're pruning and whenever you're working on your tree, try and think of that three-dimensional space, and it makes your tree a much better tree in the longer term. Okay, so it's in the same vein as what we've been talking about with the pad profiling and pruning and all that sort of stuff. I've lost count of the number of times that I've looked at someone that comes into the workshop with a beautiful tree, needs a lot of work to, because it's grown, because it's been well fed, it's been loved, it's been watered, it's been in the right spot, it's been, potted in really good mix, and there's branches everywhere, and they stand there with their scissors just looking at it, and all they say is, where do I start? Where do I start with this? Because there's this fear that we all have, and I say we because it happens to all of us with your trees. You know, as I've mentioned many times before, you get an emotional attachment to your trees. Once you get that link with your tree, it's very hard to make some serious decisions and to maybe make the cuts that need to be cut, because there's that fear that you're going to stuff it up. You know, trees being trees, though, depending on how major it is, the work that you're doing, there's always a good chance that if you do cut up and there's that oops moment, yeah, it'll grow back, or something can be changed to fix it. So it's not the end of the world if something does happen that's wrong. But it's that where do I start now that I wanted to talk about as part of this, you know, the evolution of this podcast. And I go through this process of elimination, which is, you know, when I'm pruning a pad, or, you know, it does look like a cluster of branches, and the longer you've been developing a bonsai for, obviously the more branches you're going to have, the more branches you've got, more decisions you have to make to take that bonsai to the next step, to do the maintenance work, to do what needs to be done. So the process of elimination is really easy, and I think about this almost every time I've got a pair of scissors in my hand, or branch cutters, I'm standing in front of a tree. I look at it and I go, rather than thinking, okay, that's the perfect branch to keep, and then snipping everything else off, I look at it and I'll think to myself, what doesn't fit? Which branch or which part of this pad or this apex or whatever it is that I'm working on, which part is wrong? Which part is growing incorrectly? Which part is crossing paths? What's the worst thing that's on this pad? It doesn't mean that every time you look at your tree, you know, there's things that you're going to go, well, I just hate that and that's got to go. I'm not saying it like that, but you look at from a technical point of view, what part of that needs to be removed first? Which is the one that you look at and you go, yep, that has got to go. And more often than not, it's the downward growing stuff on the pad. So step one, remove all the downward growing stuff, because that has to go. No matter what, no matter how lush it is, no matter how good it looks, if there's flowers on it, whatever it is, it's got to go, because you've got to have a clean separation at the underside of that pad. Anything growing down, you know, won't get sunlight, won't continue to grow. It takes the tree's resources. We don't need it. Step one, remove downward growing stuff. So that's probably the most wrong of the growth that you've got to remove. And then from there, it's simply a matter of going, okay, well, let's say there's 5 branches, there's 5 buds, there's 5, whatever it is in a certain area. And you look at it and go, well, okay, I've got to get back to 2. Two's the magic number, because, you know, 1 to 2 means we end up with nice divisions. We get any more than 2 things coming from one area and with a knuckle of growth, a thickening of that area, and it looks unnatural. You know, it might look good temporarily, but long-term, good structure, good bonsai, all that stuff, 1 to 2 is the magic number. So you got 5 things in that one area. Start looking at them going, okay, well, I'm growing in a certain direction. Is anything growing in the opposite direction? Of those 5 that are there, is there one pushing back towards a trunk that should be growing out from the trunk to give me that fingers up and out that we just talked about? And invariably there will be. So bang, there's one gone. Secondly, you got four branches sitting there. Of the 4, have a look at them and see which one are you going to have to put wire on to make it go the direction that you want that branch to go. If there's, of the 4 you look at, and there's one that grows sort of perpendicular to the branch, sticks out 90-degree angle from the branch, then you'd have to put wire on it to put that where you want the branch to go. Bingo, that one's gone as well. Now you're down to 3. So you haven't even looked at what's right on the branch yet. All you've done is you've removed one growing backwards in the wrong direction. You've cut one off that's growing in a funny direction out from the side of the branch. Now we're down to 3. So really, of those 3, it's okay, which ones would make the best possible branches to be flowing out from that branch, from that point in the junction of the branch? And invariably, you'll get 2 that come out almost at really nice sort of forking branches that come out, and the third one, you know, it might be a roll of a dice between, you know, 2 of them to say, well, I keep this one, I keep that one. When you get to that point, just think to yourself, it doesn't matter which one goes. If they're both similar branches and they're both growing in the same direction and they're the same strength level, then it doesn't matter which one goes. So just knock one off. If you've got two branches that are growing in the same direction and one of them's weak and one's really, really strong, then think about what stage your tree's at. If it's a highly ramified, finished tree stage sort of thing, then you want to keep the weaker ones, because strong gets stronger. Stronger means thicker. Thicker means ruined ramification. Flip it around. If it's a tree in development, then a weaker branch might not be what you want, because it's going to hold back the growth in that part of the branch, and having a stronger one in that part of the branch while you're developing, while you're growing that branch, definitely having a stronger bud in that area will be beneficial to the strength of that branch. So therefore, you get rid of the weak one. So the process of elimination doesn't need to be something that you dwell on for ages, but definitely needs decisions. Doing nothing is probably one of the worst things you can do with bonsai. You do nothing, things just get longer and longer and longer, and sooner or later they get to the point where they've got too long and we can't cut them back. Some trees we can because they'll backbud, but if you're talking about a pine or a cedar or something like that, if you keep letting things elongate and keep pushing out and getting longer and longer before you take action, then it's hard / if not impossible to correct that lack of action that you've made. So doing something which might not be 100%, maybe it's 80% correct, is far, far better than doing zero to that branch. So process of elimination, work your way back to the best options that you've got remaining. And if it means that the best options you've got need wire on them, you have to do it. That's all there is to it. You have to put wire on the best options. You don't want to suddenly cut everything off and go, wow, none of them were absolutely correct. You want to be left with the best two options that you've got. They don't have to be perfect, but they've got to be the best ones that were there. So, 2020 is flying along. I can't believe it. 2 months gone already for the year. We're into the next season. Southern Hemisphere for us in Australia, it's autumn, and particularly down here in Melbourne means that the weather's turning from our peak heat that we've had over summer. The spiking of hot temperatures doesn't mean we won't get hot temperatures, of course, but generally, all in all, it's weather starts to get a bit wetter. Daylight hours obviously get shorter. The trees start to prepare for dormancy. Start to tuck away the nuts to like a squirrel does to get through winter. And it's a really important time for us to feed our trees. I can't stress that enough. And I think it's spring obviously is an obvious one for fertilising your trees, but autumn's the one where you're going to be seeing a big return. You feed your trees well and strong during the autumn period when the trees are putting away the strength into their trunk and into their roots to get through that quiet period, the dormancy period. When spring comes around, that's when you start to see the results for it. You don't see it now. I mean, the girth of the trees will increase during the autumn period while they are tucking away the nuts. But the big benefit comes when you see spring come around and you've had very little dieback because we don't get snow. We get a few frosts and stuff like that, but we don't get a lot of dieback on our trees in Melbourne. And having strong trees means obviously you're going to have less and less than that. So feeding your trees makes them stronger and better and whatever else. But when spring comes around and they pop and they take off at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and you've got lush green foliage everywhere, and rather than walking out going, geez, I wonder why that one died, you're looking at going, well, I better get the scissors out and start doing some work. So, and that's what comes from being diligent now and putting the fertiliser on. I use the tea bag method, as I've mentioned before. Just use organic fertilisers. My rough mix is a rough 50-50 of blood and bone and an organic pellet fertiliser. I find that even though the breakdown is pretty similar between the two, I find that the blood and bone dissolves quite quickly and gets through into the trees at a rapid rate of knots. And then as that one sort of starts to dissipate, I find that the pellets actually start to get softer and start to break down as well. And so every time you water the trees, basically you're offering something to the tree. And if it wants it, it takes it. If it doesn't, it just gets watered out of the pot. So it's really, really efficient way of feeding trees. Well, that's what I find anyway. There's horses for courses. Everyone does things slightly differently, but it's something I get asked about a lot, and that's basically my regime is I put a tea bag on, maybe one to two, depending on the size of the tree and what I'm trying to do with it. But I do feed them very well throughout the autumn period. Find the tea bags last about maybe a month. So first of the month is a bit of a kick in the bum for me to say, hey, get out there and put some more fertilizer on the trees and keep them pushing. For maybe they'll last 5 weeks, maybe they'll last 3 weeks, but I find that 4 weeks is a pretty much a sweet spot for me. And I've done it for a lot of years now, and the trees look great. Everything's nice and healthy, and there are things you do, and people use different fertilizer mixes, and that's great. I think, like I said, horses for courses. If you find something that works really well for you, then you should jump at it. I like to be nice and safe with my fertilizer. I don't like to use the organics. I prefer the organic, and I only use the organic stuff when I do feed my trees. So so planning for the next month of what's happening in the garden. As I said, there's complaints from the neighbours because of the smell of the blood and bone at the moment. It's gone out fertilised, start of last weekend. Over 400 tea bags out there on trees. So everything's getting a good dose, and that'll continue. As I said, every month I'll put more on out there. It's also a really good time to have a look at your trees for pests and spraying them and stuff like that too. If you get a break in the weather for those that do like spraying, there's those that don't. That's cool, but I'm talking about what I'm doing in my garden, and I do like to stay on top of them. And I've noticed walking around lately that there's a few areas where there's some caterpillar damage and that sort of thing. So it's just a nice friendly reminder for me to make sure that I do my bit to keep the tree at its peak, or as close to its peak as I possibly can. So I'll be spraying and inspecting the trees as well, and I'm also going through now for the next couple of months and flagging trees that I want to repot when it comes time for it. And my repotting season for me here in Melbourne is pretty much deciduous getting done in the July period, and then my pines and conifers, that sort of thing, getting done in the August period. So if I start flagging now what is run out of space in the pots, everything's nice and compacted, and I've had issues with watering, then put a little flag on those ones. Any trees that maybe have been in the pot a little bit too long as well, or there's maybe the growth wasn't quite as dynamic as what I'd hoped it would have been during the spring, where I've had transpiration issues during summer, all that sort of stuff. So now it's just the time for me to go around and say, yep, you're on the list, you're fine, you're on the list, no, you're fine. And then from there I can plan for myself to know how much soil mix I've got to make up. Do I want to change pots? Do I want to do something different with the tree? Is it time to start thinking about a different angle? Is there styling work to come in line with the repotting somewhere down the track as well? So it's time for me to put some thought into the tree and what the next stage is for that tree, I suppose. So that's one of the big things that I'll be doing. And while I'm talking about pots too, I've got here sitting in front of me. Mate of mine, Adrian, he's started to carve out some natural stone for pots, and I tell you, there's a bloody few trees I'm going to be putting in these natural bits of stone too. I love what the potters do, and I think potters are fantastic, and we've got some great ones in Australia, and there's amazing ones overseas as well, and the quality around the world from what you look at just seems to be getting better and better and better, and it's amazing. It used to be you'd only think about pots from your trees coming from sort of certain areas, and that's just not the case now. It's not the dominance of pot making has now spread all around the world, and it's such an art form and such a skill that there's so many people that should be commended for the work that they put into it. But these natural bits of stone too, especially with a few of my natives and my pines and junipers and stuff like that, I think that they sort of get set off, and there's no two that are the same. When I was looking the other day for some pots. I've got a big Scots pine that I'm going to transfer in pots and slightly change angle and all that sort of stuff. And I started looking through my pots, and you go through and you go, yeah, it's pretty similar. And I started thinking about a bit of stone for it, and I thought, wow, you've really got to find the right piece of stone that fits it. But then if I can get something that does it, there's not going to be another tree anywhere around the world that's going to be in a pot that looks like that. So, so that's another thing that I'm doing is, start buying up pots and start getting all the stuff ready to go too. And like I said, it's really, I suppose the main factor that I look at with repotting is tree health. If things have started to slip a little bit, and maybe it's had a few more bugs on it or a few more issues than what I would have liked, that's also a red flag for me to say you need to look at repotting, because once the roots of the tree start to weaken, then everything else starts to collapse as well. And repotting is not one of those things where you're doing something damaging to the tree. You're actually rejuvenating the tree. You're offering stimulus to it that creates that new flux of growth that they need. And I think that if you can change your mindset with repotting from a negative one to a really positive one, I look at my trees and think, you've missed a beat. I smack myself on the wrist and say it's my fault. I should have repotted it 12 months ago. So that's where this flagging system comes in to make sure that I'm not going to miss any of those again this year. And the other thing that's going on at the moment is weeds. Weeds and weeds and weeds. It's the never-ending battle, and the more trees you have, the more weeds you have. I read somewhere a long time ago, the best time to get rid of a weed is when it first pops its head up. When it's a tiny little thing, that's the best time to get rid of it. Don't wait till it becomes a major problem and then you're chasing your tail and you never get rid of the damn things. They steal nutrients from the tree. They take water away from the tree. They're ugly. They're unsightly. They spread really fast. So, get on top of the weeds before they take hold. And it's definitely the name of the game around here. Every time I walk around, I feel like I'm plucking a bucket load of weeds out. But that's something I'm definitely going to be focusing on as we sort of start to slow down too over the next couple of months. Another thing is the shade cloth, the systems that have been up. I'm removing those. Now I like to get the airflow in there, not just for the sun. It's also shade cloth also stops some air movement in and around the trees. So I find that by removing all of that and opening up, when we do get these stronger winds that come through from time to time, it's certainly helpful when you're thinking about fungal issues with your trees. That air circulation around the trees helps drastically in that regard. So all the shade cloth will be removed, and then I'll just keep an eye out for if we have any hailstorms. It'll roll back out. I don't think we're going to have any hot days, but if anything gets above sort of high 30s, low 40s, I'll be rolling it back out. And then the next time it'll start to come out will be during winter, when we start looking at getting some frosts. It'll be put over the more sensitive trees that are prone to some dieback and some tip burn from the cold, and it'll be rolled back at them. But until then, that'll be tucked away and the yard will look nice and open again. And the last thing that's going to start happening over the next month is the autumn prune. Autumn's a great time for pruning your trees, because they've got the ability, your deciduous trees, for instance, have got the ability to heal the wounds during this period where they're still growing. It's not outward growth; it's inward growth for storing of energy, but they've got the ability to heal. Making a cut on a Japanese maple, for instance, during the heart of dormancy during winter, when they do have no leaves on them, obviously they're bare, that can have some pretty serious consequences, because it won't kill the tree, but the tree bleeds, and the tree will just keep bleeding energy and sap for quite a long while, until spring comes around and the tree reactivates, and therefore then the cambium can start to roll over and start to heal that cut, and the sap flow then will stop. I've seen it. I've done it myself. I've seen it many times where things have been pruned or branches have been broken. I had a possum break a branch once during winter, and the poor tree just bled sap for 2 months solid. I couldn't do anything to stop it. Cut putty wouldn't stop it. It kept washing away the cut paste before it had a chance to dry. So I find during autumn, when you make your prune now, that sort of sap flow issue just is non-existent. So going through all the deciduous too, as they start to get ready to drop their leaves, they'll all have a prune and a bit of clean up as well. Okay, so now it's time for what's on the bench. So the tree that I want to talk about this podcast is this blue Atlantic cedar that was recently put up onto Instagram. Beautiful tree, as I said, lovely coloured needle, very classic shape, clearly defined pads. love it. One of my favourites. Really enjoy the tree. Really love it. So with cedars, a few things that I've learned over the years, over the travels. When you want to put movement into the trunk, do it when it's nice and young. So if you're going to be buying stock that's particularly young, as soon as you get it, wire it up and put shape into the trunk. Don't focus too much on the branches and that sort of thing initially. Just try and get the movement into the trunk. And if you do buy trees from nurseries where the trunks have set, make sure that they've got some redeeming feature that you like in the trunk movement. You can definitely go for a formal upright style with them so the trunk can be dead straight. That's no problems at all. Or you can get them with movement. Either way, the one thing I would say is just be really mindful of any scarring, especially deep scarring on trunks. I've seen a few from nurseries where the scarring is quite drastic, and that scarring can be very hard, if ever possible, to get rid of on a trunk or a branch. Once it cuts in, it gouges pretty deep. You may have issues, and it may be unsightly for quite some time. That might not be a problem, but depending on the design you've got. But just be mindful that the scarring will not disappear easily. So if you're looking at trees and they've got scarring on them, maybe look for ones that don't. Now, for that tree in particular, my couple of all-round approaches that I use for that tree is I repot it about every 3 years. 3 years seems to be a good mark for it. 4 years I have let it go 4 years. It's a little bit long, but I reckon 3 years is a sweet spot for it. 2 years is a little bit too soon. It got repotted last year, I think, into that pot. Yeah, and this year when I just recently cleaned it up, the root ball had actually pushed up and started growing out of the top of the pot. So the roots of the tree had actually loved all that extra space that had been provided, and obviously the better water flow and all that sort of stuff too. So leaving them too long in their pots can be detrimental as well, because they'll become a bit pot bound, and those roots just won't be functioning the way they should be. There was, I've heard arguments for cedars, especially, that they should be on the cusp of nutrient deficiency and water deficiency, because it helps reduce the needle size of the tree. Now that's a complete opposite to the approach that I take with my trees, with all my trees. The only tree that I would hold back on fertiliser on is a white pine during the spring period, but during autumn they get double the feed. It's another tree to talk about maybe next time on what's on the bench. But so the cedars, they get fed every spring and every autumn, same as all of my other trees. They get watered in line with everything else. I don't look to starve them of anything that they desire. So you can see, I'd rather have a happy, healthy tree that is regularly getting pruned, that has needles that are appropriate to the size of the tree that I've developed. Because that's how the tree grows and that's how it functions, that's how it transpires. So I don't look at holding back, and so that's where this repotting thing I think is important to talk about early too. About every 3 years is something that I do. I have it in a really open position, as open as I possibly can. Sunny, middle of my yard, cops sun, as much sunlight as there is at cops. There's no shelter for it whatsoever. It's on a podium. It gets a lot of airflow. It's tied down. It cops the rain, the hail, the wind storms, whatever it is. So a nice open position for it. Pruning gets a clean up twice a year. Now, the first one is generally in late spring. Once spring comes around, you'll find that the buds obviously start to move at different times of the year for the different trees and different branches and all that sort of stuff. But I find that you'll get long runners starting to shoot out from the silhouette of the branches, and they start to, as I said before, as things get longer, they get thicker, so it can sort of destroy the ramification that I've built. I'd advise you that when you do see those runners, that if they're not part of the thickening process or the design process or development process, once you get to a finished tree like this one is, they've got to be removed and removed back fairly close to where they started, because you want to encourage back budding in the new part of the growth on a cedar. You won't get back budding on old wood. Once it's got bark, that's it. It's over with. So don't rely on that factor for a cedar. Rely on when you get those runners to cut them back nice and short, and it'll pop back buds in close to the trunk, which then will grow at a slower rate because the long runner's then been removed. So during spring, I'll go through, and when I say a spring prune, it might not necessarily be something which is done in one sitting. Like I won't wait till everything's shot off and run. I might walk around with the scissors, this weekend and prune the long runners that are out there, and then go back out there in another 2 weeks' time and remove the ones that have taken off since then. But generally in spring, there's this prune that I do, just focusing on those long runners. Then when it gets to autumn/winter, it'll be given a bigger dose, which involves needle plucking, removing downward growing buds, which is pretty consistent. You'll hear whenever I talk about pads, it's removing those downward ones. So needle plucking, pruning out any areas that are maybe growing in the wrong direction, restructuring the pad. Like I talked about before, that pad profile, I really try and focus on that during the autumn-winter prune. And if need be, that's the time also that I'll wire the tree. I don't wire during the aggressive growing period during spring when things get a bit more brittle. I like to do it during the autumn/winter period when things are slowing down. But that tree now is so refined that there's next to no wire on it. I use copper wire for cedars too. Don't have to, but I just find that you can use a lighter gauge, a thinner wire to get the same result. Therefore, it looks neater. Therefore, the tree stays on top peak condition. So I don't mind them once I've got it to where it is now, when it looks really nice and it's Instagram worthy, it's photo worthy. Then it sort of takes on a bit of a transition as spring comes around. It looks a little bit shaggier and grows out a little bit, which again I don't mind. New growth means new roots. It's all good. All helps the tree. I'll leave the wire on to set in place. So I talked earlier about scarring on the trunks and stuff like that becoming a pretty much an ugly eyesore that won't disappear in a relatively short period of time. With that in mind, when I do wire a branch, I like to see a bit of swelling around the wire because I know that branch then is going to be set in place. I don't want to have to wire something and then go back and rewire it again because I've removed the wire too early. So I start to let the swelling occur, then I'll take it off. That sort of scarring is not a problem. It's not even scarring. It's just a little dint on the branch, which will smooth itself off in 12 to 24 months. You won't even notice that it was there. Once I've removed the wire from the branches and they are a mature branch and they're starting to set the pad into place, then if I find that they're starting to scoop up a little bit at the ends, which is the tendency of all trees to push up towards the sun, I'll use a guy wire system where I'll drag down that branch with a guy wire. So rather than putting wire through very delicate, fine branches, I'll attach guy wires and drag the tips of the branches down on the tree too. So I do use guy wires a lot with my cedars. So the soil mix I use for that tree and for any cedar or any of most of my trees here, to be honest, is a mix of pumice, scoria and pine nuggets. I find the three work pretty well in equal portions, and I'll put possibly a light layer of fine akadama on the soil surface just to help with the surface roots and provide something nice to look at. And sphagnum moss on top of that once it's been repotted. But yeah, the soil mix is pretty common for all of my trees. I find it works really well. And the cedars that I've got, that I've worked with, love the mix. There's no complaints. One design issue that I always look at when I'm working with cedars is that the apex of the tree doesn't become too broad. I can find that very simply with focusing on the pads and the shape and that sort of stuff, the apex of the tree can sort of be allowed to grow out and out and out, and sort of then when you look at it, it's like a block, like a cube, if you like. So the apex becomes very, very flat. The sides of the apex, the outer part of the apex start to curl up and start to push, and all that growth comes up, and you start pruning almost a tabletop on top of the tree. So I do like to have a nice rounded apex that maybe isn't quite as broad. So every time I'm working on that tree, I'm looking at pushing that apex back in so I can keep it nice and tight and a sharper dome. I do like the dome shape. I don't like the pointier shape. I find that the pointy shape reminds me of a young tree, whereas the rounded dome reminds me of an older tree. Once something hits its peak and the branches can't go any higher, it starts to push out and creates that rounded dome, which is why I like that when I'm designing bonsai. So just be careful that the apex doesn't become too broad. as mentioned earlier with the pad profiling, Cedars are definitely one that you need to pad profile on and make sure that you are separating those pads and you've got them in different planes. It's so easy to have them just become one big pad. It's the easiest way to do things, and it's probably the quickest way to make something look like a bonsai. But I guarantee you longer term, 2 years, 3 years down the track from when you start with that big pad, you're going to look at it, it's going to become enormous and it's going to look quite ugly. And then you're going to go down the process of separating into smaller pads. Start with it a bit earlier. Start, maybe having the tree not look quite as bonsai-esque or as finished straight away, and break those pads apart and then let them develop separately. They'll flourish with, all that, as I talked about, the air and sunlight getting to them. They'll grow really and develop really well too. So make sure that you keep them nice and separate. And yeah, that's it. They're a great tree. They're awesome at all levels. I think that they've got a lot to offer in all different shapes. Whether they're cascading. Worked on one the other day that is the biggest cascading cedar I've ever seen in my entire life, with the branch drooping down like almost 2 meters. It was a beautiful tree, nice and thick, nice and well developed, and the pads on that are equivalent to exactly what I've got here. So they do handle cascading forms with maintaining their strength as well, with the right formatting. In formal uprights, you name it, they're great trees. So, yeah, Atlantic Cedars, they come in all different colours. I love the blue one particularly. That ticks the boxes for me. And if you haven't got one, I reckon you should get out and get yourself one. Righto, well, that brings us to the end of another podcast. Thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Really nice to know that there's a lot of people out there getting something from this podcast, because that's how it's intended. It's meant to be something which sort of provides something to make you spend more time with your trees, to do something more with them and push them to the next level, and also maybe provide a bit of reassurance somewhere along the way that you're not alone, and there's definitely people out there that are interested in what you're doing, and that there's something there for you to get into. So just a summary of the podcast. Pad profiling, really, really super important. Think about your trees in a different way when you work on them next. Go through the process of elimination. It's really easy. Once you start doing it, don't stand there with your scissors saying, what do I do? Just say, what's most wrong? Don't tell people that, but just say, what's most wrong? What's wrong with this pad or this apex or this part of the tree that I'm looking at? And then we've got March, so we're going to start getting into fertilising. That's the big one. Have an eye over your trees before they start dropping all their leaves, and maybe get on top of the pests if you have to, in any which way you choose to. It's going to be time for a clean up soon around the benches once they do start dropping the leaves, but for now we don't have to worry about that. Get lots of food into them. Maybe start thinking about giving them a prune before they do go off to sleep. And thanks for sticking around. I'll catch you next time. Thanks very much. Until then, happy bonsai.